everyone, my name is Rhys Koszczynski. This is Simple Philosophy, where we simplify philosophers to help you better understand life. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Immanuel Kant. In today's episode, I'm going to be joined by Sean Ledwith, who is a lecturer in both philosophy, politics and history, as well as a political and social commentator for the website Counterfire. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Kant's ethics, Kant's aesthetics, the Sublime, and as well other philosophers' evaluations of Kant. And without further ado, let's get into it. So we'll start with Kantian ethics. Now, Kantian ethics is quite an interesting development in terms of ethics in general. Previously, coming up with morals or how we should live our life was generally outsourced to something outside of our experience, such as a god or a monarch, or you'd be able to blame someone else for the behavior that you had conducted. And what Kant wants to do is he wants to turn that on his head and look at morality from a completely different point of view, which to a certain extent places us in the centre. So do you want to expand on Kantian ethics here, Sean?
As you say, Kant wants something that is sort of secure as your standard Christian morality, something like the Ten Commandments, but something that's not rooted in any sort of religious perspective. So Kantian ethics is designed to try and create a sort of Enlightenment version of Christian ethics. So Kant, following on from what we talked about in the last part, remember Kant believes that there is a realm of the universe called the noumena that contains concepts and entities that are beyond our comprehension. Things like God, infinity, justice, etc., beauty. One of those concepts is free will and human reason. So Kant believes that we can secure morality with using that sort of basis in the from the noumena. Now, the key concept here is the categorical imperative. Now, a categorical imperative is a proposition that, in effect, we have to follow. If we contrast it with a hypothetical imperative, a hypothetical imperative involves possibilities and probabilities. Kant believes that you cannot found morality on the basis of probability or what ifs. Morality has to be founded on what we should do. Some people might argue that if you take religion out of morality, you're really sort of creating an anything goes situation. But again, if you think back to the last part, Kant believes all human beings are equipped with these categories. And the categories means that we can discuss and create these moral rules on the basis of our universal reason. So all human beings are capable of thinking in a reasonable way. So the categorical imperative, when we get onto it, Kant believes it's something that all rational human beings can see as actually a sound basis for morality.
And it is important to note as well that he's responding to two key debates within ethics that had occurred beforehand. So you've of course got the deontologists who are arguing that we can judge right or wrong based on principles that we measure our actions against, and of course the consequentialists as well, who believe we can judge right or wrong depending on the consequences of our actions. So Kant's attempting to counter these well, mainly the consequentialists as opposed to the deontologists, but he's attempting to tackle these debates in his categorical imperative too. So we've got these three formulas of the categorical imperative here. So do you want to take us through each of these?
So the categorical imperative comes into three formulations, but it's really number one is the key one. And number one, although it might sound a rather sort of strange phrase, is actually an ancient idea, the idea of the golden rule, which goes right back to formative thinkers, people like Confucius, Buddha, or Jesus. They all had formulations of the golden rule. And again, I think it's something that most parents teach their children, essentially, which is that treat others the way you want to be treated. That is in effect. You
find on school walls as well, school walls, government buildings.
That's right, yeah. So Kant just really divides as a philosophical version of that, is that if we are in any sort of moral dilemma, what we should always ask ourselves is, well, what would the situation if everyone did this? So hypothetically, let's say if I could get someone else to sit my driving test for me, and I could get away with it and nobody would ever know, should I do it? Now Kant would argue, okay, the answer to that is, what if everyone did that? What if everyone got a stranger or a friend to sit this driving test for you? Obviously, the roads would be absolute carnage. So this is called the principle of universalizability. It was ask yourself, what would be the situation if everyone did a particular act? And again, I think, whatever we think about Kant's other aspects of Kant's philosophy, this is a very common sense view of morality. And I think the other thing this tunes into is an understanding that in many ways empathy is one of the fundamental human attributes. Put ourselves in someone else's shoes. What would happen if someone else did this? And again, like you were saying, Reese, in terms of the debate within ethics about what matters more, intentions or consequences, Kant would argue, well, even if I could get this friend of mine to pass the driving test for me, it would still be the wrong thing to do because I'm going into it with very bad intentions. But of course, in that one, the consequences would also be pretty disastrous. So the second version of this, essentially, if we all adopt the first principle, then we'll actually be in a much more harmonious society. In effect, what it's saying with point number 2 is that do not use other people. Again, very common morality, really, one that a lot of people would have without really thinking about it too much. Treat other people with respect, treat them as autonomous beings. Remember, in the Kantian philosophy, we all have autonomy in free will, even though it resides in the noumenate, we all have it. So we should all respect other people's autonomy and simply not use other people.
And in that sense, it links with the ideas of classical liberalism as well, and these ideas of harmony and individualism that were harboured during that period.
Kant really doesn't have a very well-formulated political philosophy. I mean, you can pull philosophical implications out of it. He's not really regarded as a political philosopher. But yeah, if you look at these, there is a political dimension to this. I know, as you say, Reece, it really is a form of liberalism. It's very much based on a sort of market mentality, treat other people as almost customers or consumers on the market. So it's very much based on that sort of way. Think about human beings in a sort of atomistic, self-insulated, isolated sort of way. And then the final part of the categorical imperative is really saying that if we follow the first 2 parts, we will actually have a happy society. One where there is political equality and equality before the law. So Kant really is really part of that wave of thinkers like Locke, like Montesquieu, the people who really formulate what becomes liberalism in the 19th century.
So let's take a look a little bit more detail into aspects of Kantian ethics here then. So mainly we're talking about here moving away from those ideas of religious morality and forming a new type of morality that's based on principle, essentially. That's
right, yeah, it's very much a principle-based moral philosophy. I mean, certain other moral philosophies, the other 2 main ones are utilitarianism and virtue theory. And they are much more about consequences and thinking through, well, what about this, that, and the other. Kant really wants to completely simplify moral thinking, and he really regards it as a sort of a calculus that you can just refer to, and it will give you solutions. So in terms of a moral theory, it does have that sort of consistency and rigor to it. The downside, as Kant himself explained, when he created the so-called mad axeman scenario. Of course, in Kantian philosophy, lying is excluded because if I lie, that creates the problem. Well, what happens if everyone lies? And of course, a society where everyone lies simply doesn't function. So in this scenario, if Reece has been chased by a mad axeman and Reece comes to me for sanctuary, obviously I'm going to let him hide. But then if the mad axeman turns up and says, tell me where Reece is, I have to ponder to myself, well, should I lie? From 99.9% of people say, of course you lie. But Kant would say, really, no, you can't lie because you are really compromising the categorical imperative. So there is this, I think we mentioned in the last part that there's a real purity about Kant's thinking. And in some ways you can say, well, okay, that is consistency. It's very much a system that slots into place. But I think with things like the mad axeman scenario, you could really go too far. And there's a real dogmatic inflexibility in Kant's thinking. And again, he was aware of this. He created this scenario himself. And his response was, you just go, if you start lying, even in a situation like that where it seems reasonable to lie, you actually start on a slippery slope. And eventually lying would just become a routine. So Most people disagree with Kant on this one. But again, to his credit, he actually formulates his own criticism of his own moral theory.
So the next one we've got is Kantian aesthetics, and you've posed the question: how do we value a work of art? So yeah, I'm quite interested in this section.
Let's say if there's a particular film that maybe you and I have a slightly different view on, we might say, okay, subjectively, I think that film's terrible. You think it's great. Okay, where do we go from there? Kant wants to try and come up with a way of formulating how we can have shared discussions about culture, really, about obviously books, paintings, and obviously in our time, films. So Kant's starting point is if we think about, let's say, an object like a chair. An object like a chair has a clear purpose. The purpose is for a human being to sit on it. So we measure the purpose of the chair by its ability to help us relax. Now, Kant would say that a work of art or a painting does not have a clear purpose. However, within the work of art, let's say if we take a painting like the one we've got in the slide, we can identify features of that work of art that we can all agree are actually qualities of a good work of art. So use of colour, use of symmetry, use of line. So there are factors within any work of art that we can identify as the qualities of a great work of art. Again, in a film, we might say the script, the characterization, the plot, the themes. So this concept of purposeful purposelessness, Kant is saying, is a good way of trying to identify what are the qualities of a good cultural product we can all agree with. It was the purposeful elements. And then within that, the purposeless elements are the parts where we can have a little bit of scope for disagreement. So, of course, in terms of what is the purpose of a great painting, we would never agree. For some people, let's say this painting, for some people, it's illustrating a biblical event. For other people, it's come up with a pleasing mathematical composition. We could all validly disagree on what is the purpose of art or purpose of a work of art. So Kant says we should accept that art does not have a clear purpose. But then within the work of art, we can actually agree on certain components that we would all want to see. So I think this concept of purposeful purposelessness, although it sounds paradoxical, is actually quite a clever way of trying to think about how can we discuss art. And of course, by art meaning the broadest sense. How can we have a discussion about a novel? What we would do is we'd identify what are the qualities of a great novel. That's the purposeful bit. And then within that, more subjectively, we could have our own disagreements on what are great works of art.
We even had a discussion similar to this a few months ago on the new Joker film, where we disagreed on the effectiveness of the script, but we both agreed that Joaquin Phoenix's performance was excellent and really drove the piece forward. And that's quite a good analogy of what Kant's saying here and how you can bring value out of these artifacts.
Yeah, that is a good illustration. And of course, the films like that generate a huge amount of controversy, we have to accept that there's never going to be a complete consensus on great film or just very good film or terrible film. When we discuss works of art like that, we can all articulate why we think it was a good film. But I could articulate why I think it's a great film, and you could articulate why you think it's not a great film, and we could still come up with a reasonable level of overlap between what we felt a great film was. And so I think the thing about where it says dialectical, I think Kant is accepting here that we can validly disagree on works of art, but within that disagreement there is also scope for agreement on what are the qualities of greatness in a particular genre. And I think the other thing I think worth mentioning is, I think in terms of Kant's epistemology, there is really a lack of dialectics. When we talked last time about the noumena and the phenomena, Kant tends to draw a boundary between those two. I think when it comes to morality and art, actually Kant is much more of a flexible and nuanced thinker. Interestingly enough, it's almost like these two parts of his philosophy are actually far more satisfying, I think, because there is this awareness that of this sort of dialectical quality. You can disagree on a subject, whereas when it comes to the noumena, I think most people in our sort of area would regard that the Newman as a rather sort of inflexible way of looking at the universe and the world, whereas when it comes to art, Kant is much more willing to factor in the scope for disagreement.
So the next concept we've got is this concept of the sublime, which has been brought back into popularity, particularly in psychoanalysis and psychology in recent years, with people like Lacan and Zizek discussing the concept of the sublime. But Kant's got a particular interpretation, which I think has influenced these thinkers and how they try to deduce what the sublime is. So what's Kant's kind of separations of the sublime, and how does he characterize it?
Again, to make a link with what we talked about in the first part, remember the noumena is that part of the universe that is inaccessible, beyond our comprehension, beyond our scope. Kant regards the sublime as one way in which we can sense the noumena. Now, again, if you think about these sorts of natural events, such as thunderstorms or volcanoes, if you're in the middle of one of these events, hopefully from a relatively safe distance, you get an overwhelming sense of the power of nature. We have a sense that there are parts of the universe that are powerful beyond our comprehension. So this is what Kant calls the dramatic sublime, the dramatic sublime. These are little tasters of the noumena, where we are overwhelmed by the power of nature. Now, again, in terms of what Kant calls the mathematical sublime, these are human creations, but again, where we can be overwhelmed by the sheer mastery of the creation. So an interior that we're very familiar with, Reese, the Sistine Chapel, it's impossible to go in there without being gobsmacked by the genius that created that. And likewise, I'm sure if you went to the pyramids, again, you would be overwhelmed by the mathematical quality of how on earth did they put that together, thousands of years ago. So for Kant, there are two types of sublime, in effect, one created by human beings and the other one created by nature. The common feature is these are experiences where we are overwhelmed by something that really just dwarfs us and makes us feel small and insignificant. But they are useful, Kant is saying, from an epistemological sense, because they connect us to what the noumena would be like. They are little tastes of the noumena. I suppose Kant would say that these are a little taste of the noumena. If you were actually face to face with the noumena, you will be driven mad, sort of.
Which links us back to the film In the Mouth of Madness, as that's what happens at the end when he's directly confronted with the noumena.
That's right. Yeah, I think it reminds me. I think there's a passage in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where the form of execution is to actually confront the person with the enormity of the universe. And apparently, in the novel, it like blows your mind when you're actually confronted with this. So I think that's a version of what Kant is saying. Now, the other aspect is we've got this concept of subjective universalism. Now, again, the remarkable thing about art is, when we were talking about the Joker, there's a huge scope for disagreement, but there are certain works of art and certain artists that, over centuries, no one could deny that these people are of the highest caliber. So people like Shakespeare, Leonardo and Mozart, and of course, many others. So the concept of the sensus communis is this idea that although there is scope for subjectivity, there is also this objective element where it will be sheer, just completely obtuse to try and say Mozart was not a great composer or Shakespeare was not a great dramatist. There clearly are some objective rules of aesthetics in terms of what makes a great symphony or a great play. But then, we can validly say, of course, the remarkable thing is people say, well, lots of school children say, I don't like Shakespeare. I hate Shakespeare. So we've got to leave scope for that reaction. But at the same time, even the person who says, I don't like Shakespeare, would not be valid for that person to say Shakespeare is not a great dramatist. So this concept of subjective universalism, again, is another, I think, quite a rich dialectical idea from Kant, which is this interesting phenomena whereby we can disagree about arts and novels and films, but at the same time there is a common agreement within human beings about what makes a great work of art.
Take that, hipsters. Certainly something that plagues online arguments of late. So the final thing that we've got to look at is just the evaluations from other philosophers. And we've got quite a few of selected quotes here, just taking Kant down. So I didn't know if you had anything to add to this. I know we discussed Hegel's contentions last time, but I didn't know if you had anything more to add in terms of other philosophers.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just maybe just talk about some of them. I think the one by Nietzsche, let's try and explain what does he mean. Nietzsche is trying to say that Kant, as a sort of semi-religious thinker, wanted to come up with a version of morality that was not based on religion, and an epistemology that was not based on religion. But then once Kant brought in the concept of the noumena and in effect said God is in the noumena, for Nietzsche that was Kant trying to rather sneakily smuggle God in the back door of his philosophy. So Kant leaves God out of his theory of knowledge, but then by implication Kant brings God back in and says God is in the noumena. So, I think Nietzsche very vividly described this as Kant actually crawling out of the cage of religion, so to speak, but then opting to crawl back into it. Now, the one by Lukács, I think, is probably the most common Marxist view on Kant, that he was a great philosopher. He's in many ways paves the way for Hegel and Marx, but at the same time, the great limitation of Kant again was the concept of the noumena, because Kant, the noumena is the sort of perimeter around our knowledge. And again, Lukács would argue that really reflects the nature of the bourgeois revolution. The revolutions in America, England, France, they did actually create political freedoms in a meaningful way, and they were actually far preferable to the sort of feudal system that went before. However, they stopped short on providing full emancipation. In other words, they stopped short of economic democracy. So I think this is, I think it's very enlightening view, really, is that Kant was a great philosopher, undoubtedly. However, there were sort of self-built-in limitations to his view. And again, when we mentioned Hegel on the last part, I think Hegel does rather satisfyingly explains how you can take Kant to the next stage.
And just building off that, I think recently people like, for better or for worse, Nick Land and Mark Fisher have done the same thing. They've taken kind of Hegel's gauntlet of rehabilitating Kant in a certain way and then trying to reapply him in a political realm for social and political change.
Again, just looking at the top one, the Kant was never an explicitly political thinker, although he would discuss politics and there were very sort of political implications. I think it's also worth saying that after his death, he was regarded as a standard bearer for liberalism, and a standard bearer for German nationalism as well. As a German thinker, a lot of the guys who were involved in the 1848 revolutions, they regarded Kant as someone who was on their side. A time when liberalism was a revolutionary force. He was seen as an inspirational figure to those sort of revolutionary Democrats in the 1848 revolutions.
Absolutely. So the final thing we've got, which I think is quite in keeping with what's going on at the moment with the Black Lives Matter protest, is Kant's racism, which you've brought out here. So do you want to expand on that just before we finish?
Yes, I think it is important that we do examine this side, because a lot of the great icons of Western philosophy, such as Kant, in the past there has always been a rather sort of failure really to analyse it. That a lot of these guys, people like Locke and Mill and Hobbes,
even Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, yeah, I think really any philosopher really up to maybe recent decades, there's always been a sort of racist element. And yeah, as you're saying, in the current climate, it's very important that we don't overlook that. So Kant was really a horrific racist when you look at it in terms of the things that he used to say. So when we were talking about things like the categories and the universal reason and the moral equipment that we have, Kant was explicitly saying that these are in effect the preserve of white people, and that these categories, these sorts of moral qualities, do not apply in effect to non-Europeans. So there's no getting around this. Kant was a racist. Of course, we can debate the question about, in many ways, he's reflecting the prejudice of the time, but it is important that we don't overlook this, and that people like Kant, although, you know, we should respect their greatness and their ability to sort of advance human understanding, we should also not forget that a lot of their views are completely unacceptable now.
And again, I think it links strangely back to Nietzsche as well, when he's talking about the uses and abuses of history, of the limitations of these great men, which is somewhat problematic. So thanks for that, Sean. That was really good and well articulated. So let me know down below in the comments if you agree with Kantian aesthetics. Do you think there are some works of art or film that we can objectively see as great? Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.